The sterile air of the FBI Forensic Science Division examination suite always felt like a betrayal to the narratives it contained. Here, under the unforgiving glare of the overhead fluorescence, the remnants of lives were laid bare, stripped of context, waiting for me to reconstruct their final chapters. My gloved fingers hovered over the disarticulated skeletal remains, a collection of bone fragments and larger structures carefully arranged on the stainless steel table. The scent of ozone from the air filtration system did little to mask the faint, earthy aroma clinging to the ancient calcium, a smell that spoke of soil and time. Dr. Grant, the lead investigative officer, a man whose patients I'd tested more than once, announced from the observation booth, his voice a low rumble through the intercom. "Any preliminary thoughts?" I ignored him, my focus absolute. The call had come 3 days ago, a frantic early morning summons from a construction foreman. A new commercial development, miles out past the city's sprawl, had unearthed something during excavation. They were digging foundations, deep trenches in the unforgiving clay, when the bucket of a backhoe had snagged on something unyielding. Not rock, but bone. The foreman, a grizzled veteran of 100 sites, had known enough to halt operations, the sudden silence of the machinery a stark contrast to the usual cacophony of progress. I had arrived hours later, the locally uniformed officer already establishing a perimeter. The site was a mess of churned earth and heavy equipment, a raw wound in the landscape. The officer, young and visibly uneasy, had pointed to the exposed trench. "Just old bones, sir." That's what the foreman said. Probably a cold case from way back. He'd kicked at a clump of dirt, sending a small cloud of dust into the still air. 30-40 years, maybe. I remembered the glint of sun on a fragment of tibia sticking out of the clay, and almost porcelain white against the reddish-brown. It was a common enough occurrence, construction unearthing forgotten histories. But even then, standing amidst the raw earth and the silent machinery, a faint tremor of unease had run through me. The way the soil clung, the unusual depth, the deliberate nature of the burial, even before I'd seen the full extent, suggested more than a simple, unfortunate discovery. I leaned closer, adjusting the magnification on my ocular loupe. The bones, mostly long bones and a partial cranium, were surprisingly well preserved for their apparent age, considering the damp clay environment. The soil matrix had done its job, protecting them from rapid decomposition. But preservation didn't mean an easy read. Erosion from water runoff had smoothed some surfaces, while root intrusion had left delicate, spiderweb cracks on others. My gaze settled on the right femur. Not a simple fracture, not a clean break from blunt force trauma. This was different. The edges were serrated, almost jagged, but too uniform to be from an animal. Too precise to be from the backhoe, which would have left a much more extensive, crushing injury. This looked like a saw. A rough, powerful saw. I traced the line with a sterile probe, the metal clicking softly against the bone. The cut was oblique, not perpendicular, suggesting a struggle or an awkward angle of attack. The initial assessment from the field team suggested a minimum of 3 decades. The investigative officer's voice cut in again, a slight edge of impatience now. Based on the stratigraphic layers and the type of degradation. Stratigraphic layers and degradation tell you about time, I muttered, more to myself than to him. They don't tell you about intent. I moved to the cranium fragment, carefully brushing away a stubborn speck of clay with a fine-tipped tool. The bone was thick, dense, indicative of a mature adult. And there, near the occipital protuberance, a small, circular depression. Not a bullet hole, not a natural anomaly. It was too shallow, too clean. Almost like a deliberate indentation, a point of impact from something small and round, but with significant force. A hammer, perhaps, or the blunt end of a specialized tool. It wasn't the cause of death, I was sure of that. The fracture lines radiating from it were minimal. but it was there. The femur cut, the cranial indentation, they spoke of something more systematic, more precise. Someone had gone to great lengths not just to kill, but to dismember and hide. The disarticulation wasn't random, it followed anatomical lines, albeit crudely. This wasn't an amateur hack job, but someone with a rudimentary understanding of anatomy, or at least a powerful motivation to make the body less recognizable, less transportable. My mind raced, connecting the dots. The construction site, miles from anywhere, a place where no one would stumble upon a shallow grave by accident. The depth of the burial, the manner of dismemberment. This wasn't a quick burial in the woods. This was an attempt at permanent erasure. And the tools used, rough but deliberate, suggested a killer who wanted to ensure the body would never tell its full story. This wasn't just about identifying a victim. This was about understanding a pattern. The careful concealment, the particular method of dismemberment, it was a signature. The minimum of 3 decades might be a red herring, I stated, my voice echoing slightly in the quiet suite. I finally looked up at the one-way glass of the observation booth, meeting the unseen gaze of the investigative officer. These aren't just old bones, officer. These are hidden bones. And the person who buried them didn't want them found. I returned my attention to the femur, tracing the saw marks again. This wasn't an isolated incident. The re-emergence of these remains wasn't an accident. It was a deliberate, violent echo from the past, demanding to be heard. And I was the one listening. I laid the heavy evidence box, still sealed, onto the stainless steel examination table. The femur, with its telltale saw marks, was not alone. The rest of the commingled remains, carefully excavated and bagged, waited for my methodical attention. The suite was a testament to meticulous order, gleaming surfaces, specialized microscopes, and an array of anthropological tools arranged with surgical precision. I moved with practiced efficiency, donning a fresh set of gloves, my movements economical. The lead investigator, a woman with sharp eyes and an even sharper intellect, stood by the doorway, a tablet clutched in her hand. We've got the initial psych report pulled up. Looks like a standard missing person from '93, the details are sparse. I nodded, not taking my eyes off the box. Sparse is rarely good, especially after 30 years. She gave a tight smile. That's why you're here. She left me to my work, the soft click of the door signifying her departure. I began by carefully unsealing the box. The first task was to reassemble what I could, to bring form back to the fragmented human puzzle. The skull fragments were a priority. If I could reconstruct the cranium and mandible, dental records might offer the quickest path to identification. I worked slowly, painstakingly, matching bone to bone, using a specialized adhesive to temporarily hold the pieces. Hours bled into one another, marked only by the growing pile of rearticulated skeletal elements on my work surface. Finally, the skull took shape, albeit imperfectly. The mandible was mostly intact, and a careful examination of the teeth revealed crucial details. On the upper left quadrant, a distinctive gold inlay glinted under the bright examination lamps, an older, robust restoration. More striking, however, was the congenital absence of a lower left second premolar, a rare developmental anomaly. The bone where the tooth should have formed was smooth, never having hosted a tooth bud. These were unique markers, a forensic fingerprint etched in enamel and bone. I meticulously photographed each detail, cross-referencing my findings with the limited dental information provided by the original missing persons file. The file was thin, a few photocopied pages, mostly administrative. It stated the missing individual, Elias Thorne, had no distinguishing dental work and no significant medical history. That was the first inconsistency. A gold inlay and a missing premolar were certainly distinguishing.
Next, I turned my attention to the postcranial remains.
The femur, of course, held the most immediate and disturbing evidence. But as I cleaned and examined other bones, another anomaly emerged. The left ulna, one of the two long bones in the forearm, bore the unmistakable scar of an old, poorly set fracture. The bone had healed, but the alignment was off, forming a prominent, irregular callus that would have been visible beneath the skin and certainly palpable. This was not a minor injury, it would have impacted mobility and been a significant medical event. Yet, the original file for Elias Thorne listed no such injury. It simply stated no known scars or identifying marks.
My internal alarm bells chimed louder. Two significant physical markers, both absent from the official record. This wasn't just sparse, it was misleading. Then, sifting through the smaller, more fragile bones, I found it. The sacrum, the triangular bone at the base of the spine. It presented a subtle, yet undeniable, congenital defect, a small, deep sacral dimple, accompanied by a minor spina bifida occulta, where the vertebral arch hadn't fully closed. It was usually asymptomatic, often overlooked, but it was another distinct feature, one that would be visible on an X-ray or a thorough physical examination. Again, nothing in the file. I leaned back, pulling off my gloves. The air in the suite, once sterile, now felt charged with a quiet tension. Elias Thorne, according to the official report, had been a blank slate, an unremarkable man who simply vanished. But the bones before me told a very different story. They spoke of a man with specific, identifiable features, features that should have been documented, especially if a serious search had ever been conducted. I picked up the phone, dialing the lead investigator's extension. "I have a preliminary identification," I stated, my voice steady, though my mind raced. "Elias Thorne. But the original missing persons report is either incomplete, or deliberately misrepresentative. We need to pull every single document related to his case, every dental record, every medical report, every witness statement. And I mean every single one. A pause stretched on the other end. Misrepresentative, Arthur? That's a strong claim. The bones don't lie, I countered, my gaze sweeping over the reconstructed skull, the healed ulna. The subtle sacral defect. And they're telling me someone went to great lengths to make Elias Thorne disappear, long before he actually did. The saw marks on the femur suddenly seemed less like an isolated act of violence and more like a final, desperate attempt to erase a history that someone, 30 years ago, had already tried to bury. My gut feeling from the construction site solidified into a chilling certainty. This was far more than a cold case. This was a cover-up. Fluorescent lights, unforgiving and bright, cast a clinical glow on the stainless steel surfaces and the skeletal remains laid out before me. Here, among the specialized instruments and the faint, metallic tang of reagents, the past truly revealed itself. I was hunched over the examination table, my gaze locked on the femur, specifically the precise, clean saw marks that still troubled me. If he vanished without a trace, why the effort to neatly section a bone after death? The bones don't lie conviction from the construction site still echoed in my mind, and they were whispering a story far more intricate than a simple cold case. I adjusted the magnification on the stereo microscope, bringing the bone's surface into sharper relief. The fine striations left by the saw blade were clear, but it was something else, almost imperceptible to the naked eye, that caught my attention. Deep within the matrix of the bone, near the saw cut, and even scattered faintly across other areas of the shaft, were minute, shimmering flecks. They were iridescent, catching the light like microscopic shards of abalone shell, but their color was a dull, metallic gray-green. Too consistent, too uniform to be natural mineral deposits from the soil. Carefully, using a microforceps, I scraped a few of the flecks into a petri dish. They were tiny, barely visible against the white ceramic. I applied a drop of a known chelating agent.
The reaction was immediate. A faint, almost ghostly azure bloom spread through the solution, indicating the presence of a heavy metal compound. Not just any heavy metal, but one with a specific molecular signature I recognized from my environmental forensics training. He stood at the entrance to the suite, a thick manila folder tucked under his arm. I straightened, my eyes still fixed on the shimmering residue. Potentially. I've found some unusual particulate matter embedded in the bone. Looks like an industrial compound, possibly a heavy metal salt. Sending a sample for full spectrometry now, but my preliminary tests are pointing to something specific. I gestured to the petri dish. It's not from the soil, not from the burial environment. It's from him, or whatever killed him. The investigator walked over, placing the folder on an adjacent table. He peered at the microscopic flecks. Industrial, you say? That might fit with what we're digging up on Elias Thorne. He opened the folder, flipping through documents. Thorne was a mid-level chemical technician. Worked for a company called Viridian Chemical Group. Heard of them? The name hit me with the force of a physical blow. Viridian Chemical Group. Their name was synonymous with controversy, allegations of illegal waste dumping, groundwater contamination, and a long string of lawsuits that eventually led to their dissolution 3 decades ago. Their history is extensive, especially regarding their waste management protocols in the late 80s and early 90s. They were known for using a particular compound in their manufacturing process, a compound that, if improperly disposed of, could have led to exactly the kind of particulate I'm seeing here. My gaze swept from the petri dish back to the femur. Then to the reconstructed skull, the healed ulna, the subtle sacral defect. All the identifiers pointing to Elias Thorne. The investigator nodded, his expression grim. That fits even better. Our initial records suggest Thorne was a whistleblower, or at least suspected of being one. He was supposedly compiling evidence against Viridian regarding their environmental practices. Went missing right around the time the allegations started to surface, just before the company went into full damage control mode. My mind raced. The saw marks on the femur. The precise cut, almost clinical. Not an act of rage, but of deliberate concealment. If Thorne was exposing Viridian, and he suddenly disappeared, then his body, if found, would be a direct link back to them. The saw marks, the careful dismemberment, it wasn't just to make him disappear. It was to make him unidentifiable, to erase any trace of who he was and where he had been working. And the company tried to bury the evidence, quite literally. The discrepancy in his disappearance timeline. It means he was likely killed before his official missing person report, and the company orchestrated his disappearance to buy themselves time, to control the narrative. The investigator's jaw tightened. It would certainly explain why the official investigation hit so many dead ends. Powerful company, political connections. It wasn't just a missing person, it was a ghost they wanted to keep buried. And the saw marks, I continued, pressing a finger against the bone, they weren't just about disposal. They were about making sure no one could connect his back to Viridian. No dental records if the jaw was gone, no unique bone features if the body was scattered. But they weren't thorough enough. They left a part of him, a part of their dirty secret, embedded in his very bones. The implications were vast, sprawling beyond a single victim. A powerful, now-defunct corporation, decades of environmental malfeasance, and a deliberate cover-up that had held for over 30 years. This wasn't just about Elias Thorne anymore. It was about exposing a systemic conspiracy, one that had likely claimed more than one life to protect its secrets. Dig deeper into Viridian Chemical Group, I instructed the investigator, my voice firm, resolute. Every employee, every lawsuit, every environmental incident report from that era.
especially anything around the time Thorne went missing. I need to know everything. He nodded, already pulling out his phone. Consider it done. This changes everything. I turned back to the remains, my gaze sweeping over the silent bones. They had waited patiently in the earth, holding their secrets. The bones had spoken, and I was listening. Than I had dared to imagine. I stood over the articulated skeleton, the bones laid out meticulously on the stainless steel table, each fragment a word in a sentence of suffering. The truth emerging was not merely about a single life extinguished, but about a deliberate, calculated act, a cold removal. My fingers traced the clean fracture line on the fifth rib, a perimortem injury consistent with blunt force trauma. This wasn't an accident. This was murder. The suite itself was a study in controlled chaos, banks of monitors displaying X-rays and 3D reconstructions, microscopes glinting under focused lamps, and an array of specialized tools neatly arranged on trolleys. The air carried a faint antiseptic scent, overlaying the deeper, earthy smell still clinging to the bones despite their careful cleaning. She approached, a thick, worn file clutched in her hand. Beyond confirming blunt force trauma as the likely cause of death, I'm seeing evidence of significant muscular development in the upper body, consistent with manual labor or a physically demanding occupation. I replied, my gaze fixed on the broad scapulae. And the dental work, while common, indicates a consistent, if basic, level of care. Nothing high-end, but not neglected either. She nodded, flipping open the file. We've been digging into the history of the construction site. It's been slated for development for decades, always hitting snags. Environmental protests, local opposition, land disputes. The usual. She paused, her eyes narrowing. But something feels off. Too many snags, too many people raising objections who then just vanished from the public record. My attention sharpened. Vanished? That's the word. Not official disappearances, not always. More like, they just stopped being a nuisance. Moved away, changed their minds, dropped off the radar. She slid a printout across a nearby counter, a grainy black and white photograph of a man with a determined jaw and defiant eyes. This is Thomas Albright. He was a vocal leader of a local environmental group, strongly opposed to the initial plans for the site back in the late 90s. Went missing in 97. Never found. I picked up the photograph, comparing the facial structure to what I could reconstruct from the skeletal remains. The victim's jawline was similar, the brow ridge pronounced. Any records of him being connected to the corporation pushing the development? He was a thorn in their side, the investigator confirmed. Public meetings, petitions, media interviews. He was everywhere. Then, nothing. She gestured to the file. We've cross-referenced other names from old news archives related to the project. There's a pattern, Arthur. Too many coincidences to ignore. I took the file from her, my fingers brushing against the aged paper. I began to sift through the documents, yellowed newspaper clippings, faded police reports, transcribed testimonies from community meetings. The names blurred initially, then coalesced into a disturbing tableau. A local journalist, known for investigative pieces on corporate ethics, had penned several scathing articles about the development company's questionable land acquisition tactics. He died in a boating accident a year after Albright disappeared, the official ruling citing unforeseen circumstances and faulty equipment. No foul play suspected. Next, a former employee of the corporation, a mid-level manager who had supposedly threatened to expose irregularities in their environmental impact assessments. He'd suffered a fatal heart attack in his sleep, despite having no prior history of cardiac issues and being relatively young. His death was also deemed natural. The sheer audacity of it.
Each individual had stood in the path of the corporation's relentless pursuit of the land, and each had subsequently been removed from the equation. Thomas Albright, the environmentalist, was just one more casualty in a long line. My victim, the bones on the table, was another. "Look at these dates," I said, pointing to the timelines.
Albright's disappearance, the journalist's accident, the manager's heart attack.
They all fall within a 5-year window, roughly 30 years ago. A truth that had been buried not just in the earth, but in layers of official reports and public indifference.
This wasn't a simple investigation anymore.
This was an excavation of a deeply rooted conspiracy, and the forces behind it were far more dangerous, far more powerful, than I had initially conceived. My determination hardened, solidifying into an unyielding resolve.
I would unearth every last one of their secrets.
Fluorescent lights cast a stark, unforgiving glow on the polished steel tables and the array of instruments I had laid out.
Here, the remains, now meticulously cleaned and rearticulated, lay before me under a powerful magnification lamp. I had been at it for hours, the sterile silence broken only by the click of my probes and the rustle of my notes. The bones, once a jumbled puzzle, were now telling a clearer story. My fingers traced the delicate sutures of the cranium, noting the early fusion that indicated a younger age than initially estimated. The wear patterns on the teeth, though subtle, suggested a diet consistent with someone who had grown up in a specific, less affluent region, details that were beginning to paint a picture of the individual, not just the victim. What truly gripped me, however, were the perimortem fractures. Not just the blunt force trauma to the skull, which was undeniable, but the defensive fractures on the left ulna and radius, and the subtle, almost hairline crack on a rib, suggesting a struggle before the final, fatal blow. These weren't the injuries of a random accident or a simple fall. This was violence, deliberate and brutal. And then there was the specific residue I'd scraped from the inner surface of the cranium, a faint, almost microscopic trace. It wasn't earth. It wasn't plant matter. It was a synthetic polymer, distinct and peculiar. My initial chemical tests were preliminary, but they hinted at something used in specialized industrial applications, not common household items. This was no isolated incident, I felt it in my gut, confirmed by the evidence under my scrutiny. The pattern of trauma, the specific burial depth relative to the construction timeline, the odd polymer, it all pointed to something far more sinister and organized than a simple cold case. A sharp rap on the glass partition of the suite jolted me. I looked up to see a senior bureau agent, a man whose tailored suit always seemed a size too small for his expansive frame, his expression tight. He gestured for me to join him in the adjacent observation room. I sighed, setting down my tools. This was earlier than I expected the inevitable pushback. "Arthur," the senior agent began, his voice surprisingly calm as I stepped into the room, the scent of stale coffee clinging to the air. "I understand you've been making significant progress." He picked up a folder from the small table, flipping through a few pages of my preliminary report. His eyes scanned the text, but I knew he wasn't truly reading it. He was looking for an angle. "The remains belong to a male, likely early 20s, not 30s as first thought," I stated, cutting straight to the point. "The perimortem trauma is extensive, consistent with a targeted assault, not an accident. And I've found trace evidence, a synthetic polymer, that suggests an industrial connection. This isn't just an old, forgotten burial. This is a homicide, and potentially part of a larger pattern." The senior agent closed the folder with a soft thwack. "Arthur, we appreciate your thoroughness. Truly. But we're getting some questions from very high up. This construction project is critical infrastructure. Any delays, any public disturbance, could have significant economic repercussions." My jaw tightened. Are you suggesting I ignore the evidence?
He leaned forward, his voice dropping slightly, though his eyes remained hard.
I'm suggesting we manage expectations. The resources required for a full-scale investigation into a potentially 30-year-old homicide are immense. We have active cases, current threats.
Diverting resources for what might be a singular, isolated incident, however tragic, is simply not feasible right now.
A singular incident?
I scoffed, the frustration beginning to bubble.
The bones show multiple points of trauma, suggesting prolonged torture, not a quick, isolated event, and the polymer? It's specific. It connects to something. This isn't just about these remains.
This is about a system that allowed someone to disappear without a trace, and a killer who thought they got away with it. The senior agent's gaze hardened. Arthur, you're an anthropologist.
You've done that. The rest. The interpretation of patterns, the system's failures, that's outside your purview. The official narrative needs to be carefully constructed. We can't afford to destabilize a major project based on what might be an overzealous interpretation. Overzealous?
I took a step closer, my voice low but firm.
The truth isn't overzealous.
There's a distinct possibility this individual was part of something larger. I'm seeing signs of systemic cover-up, not just a single, isolated crime. The burial site, the lack of previous reports despite the clear signs of violence, it screams of deliberate concealment. He stood up, his posture radiating authority.
Your contract, Arthur, is for forensic consultation.
Not for initiating political investigations.
You are to finalize your report on the identification and immediate cause of death. Any further speculation about patterns or systemic cover-ups will be considered outside your mandate and could jeopardize your future involvement with the Bureau.
The threat was clear, unspoken but potent. He was telling me to back off, to sanitize my findings, to conform to a pre-approved narrative.
I understand, I said, though my voice was clipped. I didn't understand in the way he meant. I understood that the powerful forces I had suspected were now actively trying to suppress the truth. He nodded, satisfied. Good. See that it's done.
With that, he turned and left, the door clicking shut behind him, leaving me alone in the silent observation room.
My gaze drifted back to the examination suite, to the bones lying under the lamp.
They were still there, silent witnesses to a crime that powerful people wanted to keep buried. The senior agent's words hadn't deterred me, they had solidified my resolve.
If the official channels were going to be blocked, then I would have to find another way.
The system was resistant, but I was determined. The game had just changed. It was a constant, low thrum, a mechanical heartbeat beneath the cold, clinical light. I stood by a stainless steel counter, a sheaf of digitized reports spread before me on a secure tablet. The words of the regional director still echoed, a silken cord of warning wrapped around my throat. I understand, I had said, but my understanding was that I was alone, navigating a labyrinth. Built by powerful hands. My resolve, far from wavering, had solidified into something cold and sharp.
They wanted me to sanitize the findings? I'd dig deeper.
I'd spent the last 24 hours immersed in the digital archives, sifting through decades of local police reports, missing persons files, and property deeds linked to the construction site. The skeletal remains had been a starting point, a thread leading back to a young woman, a local activist whose disappearance 30 years prior had been quietly filed away. My current focus was on the periphery of that case, the community outcry, the protests, the names of those who had demanded answers. Most had faded into obscurity, but one name surfaced repeatedly in the yellowed news clippings and handwritten police notes, a woman who had vehemently accused a high-ranking corporate executive of intimidation tactics, just days before the victim vanished. Her own public presence had then abruptly ceased. It took a full morning of cross-referencing old phone directories, electoral rolls, and property tax records, leveraging every obscure database access I possessed. I traced her last known address to a small, isolated town nestled in the foothills, a place that time seemed to have forgotten. The drive was long, the asphalt giving way to gravel, then eventually to a dirt track winding through dense pine forests. The air grew cooler, carrying the scent of damp earth and resin. The address led me to a small, weathered cabin, its paint peeling, a plume of wood smoke curling lazily from its chimney. An old pickup truck, rusted at the fenders, sat parked beside a stack of firewood. I approached the front door slowly, my hand hovering before I knocked. The wood felt rough under my knuckles. After a long moment, the door cracked open, revealing a sliver of a face, framed by wispy gray hair. Her eyes, though clouded with age, held a flicker of the fire I had read about in the old reports. Fear, too, was etched around them, deep lines that spoke of a life lived on edge. Arthur Grant, I introduced myself, keeping my voice low, non-threatening. I'm looking into the disappearance of the young activist. 3 decades ago, his gaze sharpened, a wariness that was almost palpable. That's old news. He rasped, his voice dry like autumn leaves. Been buried for a long time. Some things don't stay buried, I countered gently. Not when bones surface, he hesitated. His eyes scanning the forest behind me as if expecting unwelcome company. Finally, she opened the door wider, stepping back to allow me entry. The cabin was small, sparsely furnished, but meticulously clean. A worn armchair, a small table, and a wood-burning stove dominated the main room. The air was warm, thick with the scent of pine and something else, old memories, perhaps, clinging to the fabric of the room. Sit, she offered, gesturing to the armchair. I took the seat, watching her settle onto a wooden stool opposite me, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. I read your old statements, I began, choosing my words carefully. About the protests. Pushing people out, buying up land for nothing, and then. The young activist started asking questions. Real questions. You mentioned a corporate enforcer, I prompted, a man who threatened you and others. Her eyes flickered, a shiver running through her thin frame. He wasn't subtle. She closed her eyes, a faint tremor in her jaw. When she opened them again, they were glazed with a distant horror. The day before she disappeared. I saw them. Down by the old logging road, not far from where they were clearing land. He was arguing, her voice sharp. He was calm. Too calm. Like a predator. He had her by the arm, dragging her towards a black sedan. I thought he was just taking her for a talk. She swallowed hard, her voice cracking. I should have done more. I should have called someone. But he saw me. Just for a second. His eyes. She trailed off, a gasp escaping her lips. He smiled. Like he knew I wouldn't say anything. That I couldn't. Her breath hitched, and she began to weep silently, tears tracing paths down her weathered cheeks. He knew. He always knew. They had power, Arthur, so much power. They could make people disappear. And now, I was digging it all up. The tension in the small cabin was suffocating, the air thick with unspoken dangers. I had found my living witness, and he had just confirmed my gravest suspicions. Fluorescent lights hummed, casting a cold, even glow over the stainless steel countertops and precision instruments. I stood before a large monitor, the pixelated image of an aging sedan frozen on the screen. The vehicle was unremarkable, a ubiquitous model from 3 decades past, yet its very ordinariness was what made it sinister. This was the car, or one very much like it, the fear-silenced witness had finally whispered about, driven by the corporate enforcer. The high-ranking corporate enforcer, his reputation for quiet brutality, now tied directly to the disappearances. The specific vehicle, a black sedan, registered to a shell company long dissolved but once linked to the same powerful corporation I'd been investigating.
Away from prying eyes.
They stopped making things a long time ago, but the lights. Sometimes they were still on. The threat I had received, a blunt, anonymous message delivered to my personal device, felt less like a distant echo and more like a direct consequence of my proximity to this truth. The director's quiet warning, a genuine concern etched on his face, resonated in the quiet hum of the suite. I was no longer just a forensic anthropologist, I was a target. I cross-referenced the vehicle's registration details with historical property records, filtering for abandoned industrial sites previously owned or operated by the corporation. The FBI's expansive databases churned, sifting through decades of forgotten real estate transactions.
A handful of properties surfaced, mostly warehouses and dilapidated administrative buildings.
But one entry stood out, an abandoned manufacturing plant, miles off the main road, nestled deep within a forgotten industrial park on the city's outskirts. It had been shuttered for over 30 years, its official reason for closure cited as economic restructuring. The coordinates placed it precisely in the desolate zone the witness had described.
Arthur.
Anything? A colleague asked, passing by, a stack of files tucked under his arm.
Just connecting some old dots, I replied.
My gaze fixed on the satellite imagery of the plant. Overgrown access roads, a collapsing main gate, and a roofline that sagged like a broken spine.
Perfect.
A hidden lair, indeed.
I spent the next few hours preparing.
My field kit, usually reserved for archaeological digs, now held different tools, a high-powered flashlight, a compact digital camera, gloves, evidence bags, and a small, portable ground-penetrating radar unit. I packed a spare battery for everything. I wouldn't be going in with a full team, not yet. The systemic nature of the conspiracy meant I couldn't risk a premature, official approach that might tip off the very people I was trying to expose. I needed irrefutable proof, undeniable physical evidence that would stand up against any political maneuvering. The sky, a bruised purple, bled into the horizon as dusk settled. The air grew heavy, thick with the scent of damp earth and decay.
The plant, a hulking silhouette against the twilight, loomed ahead.
I parked my vehicle a quarter-mile down a dirt track, hidden by a dense stand of pines. The walk to the facility was a testament to its abandonment. Weeds clawed through cracks in the asphalt, and shattered glass crunched under my boots. The main gate was twisted off its hinges, a silent invitation. I circled the perimeter, my flashlight beam cutting through the gloom, searching for an entry point that wouldn't announce my presence. I pulled myself up, careful not to snag my clothes on the splintered wood, and slipped inside.
The interior was a mausoleum of industry. Dust motes danced in my flashlight's beam, disturbed by my entry. Machinery, hulking and skeletal, lay dormant, draped in decades of grime.
I moved methodically, scanning for any signs that this place was more than just an abandoned factory. My beam swept across the floor, the walls, the ceiling. Then I saw it, a section of the concrete floor, roughly 20 feet by 20, that was a slightly different shade, a newer pour. It was subtle, almost imperceptible in the low light, but my eyes were trained for anomalies.
This wasn't part of the original construction. The aggregate felt different, less worn.
There were faint, almost invisible score marks, as if something heavy had been dragged across it repeatedly. I deployed the ground-penetrating radar. The screen flickered to life, displaying subterranean layers. Beneath the newer concrete slab, the readings were chaotic, inconsistent with solid earth or bedrock.
Multiple anomalies. Disturbances. My breath hitched. This wasn't just a burial.
It was a mass grave, meticulously concealed. I retrieved a small, specialized hammer and chisel from my kit. The first chip of concrete flew, then another. Minutes stretched into an eternity as I slowly, painstakingly, broke through the top layer.
Decomposition.
Beneath the concrete, a layer of compacted earth and lime. I began to excavate, carefully, methodically, brushing away the soil. Within minutes, my flashlight beam caught something.
Bone.
I worked faster now, adrenaline coursing.
Soon, more shapes emerged.
A partial cranium, its fragile structure compromised. These weren't just old bones, they were human remains, clearly interred with haste and malice. The way the bones lay, intertwined, suggested multiple individuals. As I exposed more of the shallow grave, the extent of the horror became sickeningly clear. I counted at least 3 distinct sets of skeletal remains, their positions indicating they had been unceremoniously dumped, then covered. Nearby, beneath a thin layer of soil, was a bundle of heavy-gauge plastic sheeting, brittle with age but still discernible. It was the kind used for industrial packaging, perfect for wrapping and concealing. This wasn't a one-off act of violence, this was a system, a clandestine operation designed to make people vanish without a trace. The pattern of disappearances, the corporate malfeasance, the political cover-ups, all of it converged here, in this forgotten industrial tomb. I photographed everything, meticulously documenting the scene. This wasn't just a few victims, this was a deliberate, calculated disposal site, active over years. The realization hit me like a physical blow. I had found the hidden lair, and its secrets were far more gruesome than I could have imagined. A sudden, faint creak echoed from deeper within the factory, a sound that wasn't the wind, wasn't the settling of old metal. My head snapped up, flashlight beams sweeping the cavernous space. My presence might not have been as covert as I'd hoped.
I wasn't alone. The director's warning, still a low thrum in my ears, sharpened my focus. The threat, a digital whisper of malice, had attempted to derail me, but it had only cemented my resolve. Overhead lights hummed, casting a stark, unforgiving glow on the assembled faces, the director, a lead investigator, and 2 seasoned field agents. They watched me, their expressions a mix of skepticism and guarded expectation. "Gentlemen," I began, my voice steady, projecting across the polished surfaces. "What we have here isn't a collection of disparate cold cases. Identified through dental records as a site foreman who vanished in '92, exhibits perimortem trauma consistent with blunt force to the cranium, followed by dismemberment.
The cuts, precise and deliberate, suggest a familiarity with anatomy, or at least, an understanding of how to efficiently reduce a body for transport."
I moved to the next table,
where a smaller, more fragmented collection of bones lay. These belonged to a whistleblower, an environmental auditor, reported missing in '98. The specific fracturing pattern on the ribs, along with the telltale burnishing on the vertebral bodies, points to
a high-pressure compaction injury.
He wasn't just murdered, he was crushed, his remains dispersed. We found microfragments of concrete aggregate embedded in the bone matrix, identical to samples from the original construction site. My gaze swept across their faces, gauging their absorption. The lead investigator scribbled notes, his brow furrowed. The director remained impassive, but his eyes never left mine. Each of these individuals, I continued, represented a liability to the corporate entity that owned the land. The foreman, aware of structural shortcuts.
The auditor, privy to toxic waste disposal violations.
The pattern repeats, a threat to the bottom line, a sudden disappearance, and a meticulously concealed burial. I brought up a holographic projection, displaying a timeline I had painstakingly constructed. Dots representing disappearances aligned perfectly with major construction phases and regulatory inspections of the corporation.
The soil analysis from each burial site, across multiple decades, shows unique mineralogical signatures. However, all sites share a common, highly specific contaminant profile, a rare industrial lubricant, phased out of general use in the late 80s, but still manufactured exclusively by a subsidiary of the parent corporation until recently. A ripple of murmurs went through the small group. I pressed on, my voice gaining momentum. This isn't random. This isn't coincidence. This is a systemic elimination of problems, orchestrated by individuals with access to heavy machinery, secure disposal sites, and the power to make people vanish without a trace. The same lubricant, the same method of disposal, the same corporate entity. 30 years. 6 confirmed victims, with strong indicators for more. I pointed to a specific sequence on the timeline. The abrupt resignation of the regional operations manager in 1993. Followed by his rapid promotion to a senior executive position within the parent company, directly correlates with the disappearance of the foreman who threatened to expose construction flaws. Similarly, the former governor's sudden backing of controversial zoning changes, benefiting the corporation, coincided precisely with the auditor's disappearance. Substantial. But implicating figures of that magnitude requires more than forensic inference. It requires action, I countered, my eyes locking with his. The evidence is undeniable. The bones don't lie. The soil doesn't lie. The pattern of disappearances, linked by unique forensic markers and corporate timelines, paints a picture of deliberate, calculated murder and cover-up. This isn't just about finding a killer, it's about dismantling a criminal enterprise that has operated with impunity for decades, protected by its wealth and influence. Just as the lead investigator was about to respond, the heavy steel door to the suite hissed open with an unexpected burst of force. A tall, imposing figure, his suit impeccably tailored, his face a mask of controlled fury, strode in. These are baseless accusations against legitimate business operations. The director stepped forward, placing himself subtly between me and the enforcer. This is an active investigation, Mr. Your presence here is unauthorized. Unauthorized? The enforcer scoffed, a humorless sound. My principals have a vested interest in ensuring this. Charade. Does not proceed. You are treading on dangerous ground, Doctor. You've been warned. His gaze flickered back to me, holding mine. The message was clear, the threat wasn't an echo, it was a promise. The ground you've buried people in for 30 years is far more dangerous, I retorted, my voice unwavering, despite the adrenaline coiling in my gut. Your principals won't be able to buy their way out of this. The bones speak louder than any corporate lawyer. His jaw tightened, a muscle twitching in his temple. You think you're clever, don't you? Digging up old stories. You have no idea the forces you're playing with. He took a step towards me, his hand subtly moving towards the inside of his jacket. We have more than stories. The lead investigator cut in, his voice firm, drawing the enforcer's attention. We have forensic proof, connecting a multi-decade pattern of disappearances directly to your corporation's activities. We have multiple victims, each eliminated when they became an inconvenience. And now, we have you, walking into an active FBI investigation, attempting to intimidate a witness. The enforcer froze, his hand dropping from his jacket. His eyes darted around the room, finally registering the unwavering stares of the agents, their postures subtly shifting, ready. The air crackled with a sudden, potent tension. The bluff was called. The intimidation had failed. The director's face remained stern, but I saw a flicker of satisfaction in his eyes. The enforcer's carefully constructed facade began to crumble, replaced by a raw, desperate fear. The full weight of the decades-long conspiracy, exposed and undeniable, was finally bearing down.
The frantic energy of the previous night had dissipated, leaving behind a residue of exhaustion and a strange, almost disorienting calm. I stood by a stainless steel counter, a sheaf of documents spread before me, the crisp white pages stark under the unforgiving light. My coffee, long cold, sat untouched beside a microscope. The director and his enforcer had been taken into custody with a surprising lack of further resistance once the bluff was truly called. The air had gone from electric to dead still in an instant, the weight of multiple armed agents proving more persuasive than any threat. The subsequent hours had been a blur of interviews, evidence securing, and the slow, meticulous process of untangling the threads of their immediate operation. But the real work, the 30-year-old work, was just beginning. My gaze drifted to the evidence bags laid out on an adjacent table, a worn leather-bound ledger, its pages brittle with age. Recovered from a hidden compartment in the director's private study, a series of faded photographs depicting a younger version of the director alongside several local politicians and corporate executives. All smiling, all long since vanished from public life or ascended to new heights of power, and a digital storage device. Its contents now being painstakingly extracted by a technical analyst across the room. "It's all here, Arthur," a senior agent stated, approaching my counter. Her voice was low, almost reverent. The full scope. The land acquisitions, the resource extraction licenses, the environmental reports that were buried. And the people who stood in the way. I nodded, my eyes tracing a line in the ledger. It was a meticulous accounting, not of finances, but of personnel. Names, dates of hire, dates of termination, and then, chillingly, a separate column marked with cryptic codes. These weren't dismissals, they were disappearances, each one meticulously logged, each one a life extinguished for profit. The skeletal remains I'd unearthed at the construction site, the others found over the years, they were all entries in this ledger of human cost. The initial victims were low-level employees, whistleblowers who'd seen too much. Later, it expanded to local landowners, small business owners who refused to sell, environmental activists. Anyone who threatened the expansion of their illicit empire. The reveal wasn't a single flash of insight, but the slow, horrifying convergence of these disparate pieces of evidence. The construction company, a shell corporation for decades, had been systematically acquiring land through intimidation and, when that failed, through lethal force. The political cover-ups weren't just about turning a blind eye, they were active participation, facilitated by a network of corrupt officials who benefited from the lucrative, often illegal, ventures. The director, a man of quiet menace, had been the architect of this brutal efficiency, ensuring no loose ends remained. The implications were staggering. This wasn't just a handful of murders, it was a systemic cleansing, a calculated pattern of disappearances. Designed to protect a vast, interconnected web of corporate malfeasance. I felt a profound weariness settle into my bones, heavier than any physical exertion. The pursuit of justice was often a lonely path, but this felt like uncovering a subterranean river of corruption that had flowed unseen for generations. The satisfaction of the arrests was tempered by the sheer scale of the horror. The public reaction will be seismic, I murmured, more to myself than to the agent. She exhaled slowly. It already is. The preliminary reports are out. The news channels are running non-stop. People are demanding answers. They want to know how this went on for so long. That was the question, wasn't it? How did so many powerful individuals conspire to bury so many lives for so long? The director hadn't acted alone. He was a cog, albeit a crucial one, in a much larger, more entrenched machine. Days bled into nights. My cot in the FBI facility felt more like home than my own apartment. I spent hours poring over geological maps, comparing old property deeds with the ledger entries, cross-referencing names with missing persons reports from decades past. Each match was a small, grim victory. Each identified victim was a step towards reclaiming their story, pulling them from the anonymity of the earth. The initial shock of the arrests was giving way to the grim reality of legal proceedings. Indictments were being prepared, lawyers for the accused were already circling, preparing their defenses. The fight ahead would be long and arduous. These were powerful people, with resources and connections that ran deep. But for the first time in 30 years, the truth was out. The ashes of their carefully constructed lies were scattered, and the possibility of rebirth, of true justice, was finally within reach. My work was far from over. I would testify, I would consult, I would ensure that every single bone, every shred of evidence, told its complete, unvarnished story. The weight of it all was immense, but so was the resolve. And I would keep marching.